Let's all turn in our Bibles to Mark chapter 9. Mark chapter 9. We're going to begin there this morning. We're going to read a section of text starting in verse 14. The text there says, "And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them, and scribes disputing with them. Immediately, when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, 'What are you discussing with them?' Then one of the crowd answered and said, 'Teacher, I brought you my son, who has a mute spirit, and whenever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not.' He answered him and said, 'O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me.' Then they brought him to him. And when he saw him, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, 'How long has this been happening to him?' He said to him, 'From childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us.' Jesus said to him, 'If you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes.' Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, 'Lord, I believe, help my unbelief.' When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, 'Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more.' Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, 'He is dead.' But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had come into the house, his disciples asked him privately, 'Why could we not cast it out?' So he said to them, 'This kind can only come out by nothing but prayer and fasting.'" Here we see the apostles come, and they have utterly failed in front of a crowd. You know, we all experience failures in our life. It's not something that is unique to any one individual. All of us have them. They're embarrassing, they're painful, they're humiliating to us when they happen. And our response, however, is something that can be life-changing. We can allow failures that are embarrassing and humiliating to make us either bitter about things, about life in general, or about certain people, or we can allow them to make us better. The second of those is the most preferred, as you can well see. We can take the failure as corrective, we can take it as instructive, and we can learn from it. And that's going to make us better for that. We all need to learn certain lessons in life, and this is one of those that we need to learn. We need to learn how to say, "I need help. I can't do this myself." We need to learn to listen to the words that are told to us in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 13 that we all know. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It doesn't say I can do all things in and of myself, but through Christ who strengthens me. So that being the case, I need to do certain things. I need to let certain things propel me towards God. Think about these things with me for a minute. I need to let my weaknesses drive me to His strengths. I need to let my own powerlessness drive me to His omnipotence. He is the one with the power. He is the one with the answers. I need to let my own limitations drive me to His unlimited resources. I need to let my humility drive me to His all-sufficiency. Look with me at 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Paul famously says some words there that we need to take to heart. Verse 7 there says, "Unless I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities, in reproaches, in deeds, in persecutions, in distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. We need to have that attitude. Take things to God. Too big for us, especially when you get into the spiritual realm. Mark 9 that we started out with, that's going to be our text for the day. If you've got a Bible, a marker in your Bible, I suggest that you put it there. It'll be greatly helpful for you because we're going to be going other places but coming back there inevitably. It's a very interesting section of text. I don't have an answer for everything, every question that you might have about the text. It is perplexing that the apostles weren't able to do this thing of casting out this demon. And I don't know that I know the answer of exactly why that is. I think I know something from the text, and I think certainly what I see in the text, I think I can learn something from it. Hopefully you can do that too. Maybe we can tell why it's at least preserved for us. It's interesting to note some of the facts or the events leading up to Mark chapter 9 and verse 14 through 29, where this young boy was healed by Jesus. Jesus, of course, we back up. I want us to back up into chapter 8 of Mark, verse 31. It says, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and after 3 days rise again. We think about that. This is going to be a low point for the apostles, to the point that Peter even rebukes Jesus, and Jesus ends up telling him, get behind me, Satan. This is something that Jesus has to do. We understand it fully now. Obviously, at the time, they didn't fully understand it. The fact is, he's going to Jerusalem to die. He announces that to them. This has got to be a low point for them. And it's immediately really followed by what I would consider a mountaintop moment for them. We go down into chapter 9 now and start reading there in verse 2. Now, after 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John and led them up on a high mountain apart by themselves, and he was transfigured before them. His clothes became shining, exceedingly white like snow, such as no launder on earth can whiten them. And Elijah appeared to them with Moses, and they were talking with Jesus. Then Peter answered and said to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah, because he did not know what to say, for they were greatly afraid. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, this is my beloved Son. Hear him. This, can you imagine being there? It would be for us like going up onto a mountaintop with maybe one of the apostles and Jesus and Paul and Peter are there, and we see them. And we would think, it is so wonderful to be up here away from all the stuff that we have to deal with in this life. Certainly a high point. Notice the words of Peter. Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Starkly different than what Jesus said earlier. Not different necessarily, but you get a different vibe from it. I'm going to Jerusalem to die. But now, Peter, experiencing all this, it's good for us to be here. I don't want to think about all those other things, but this is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him. Staying on the mountaintop is desirous, isn't it? From our standpoint. But the mountaintop, the good times, is not where growth occurs. Growth doesn't occur where things are easy and where we say, it's good, this is great. They occur other places. And Jesus then leads them down the mountain, and on the next day, that's what Luke 9 tells us. This happens on the next day, verse 37 in Luke 9. The boy is healed by Jesus that we read about and have read about here in Mark chapter 9. And here, Going from Jesus is going to die to it is good for us to be here, and now the disciples struggle again. Another low point. This is where learning takes place, and certainly they're going to learn a lesson here. He has shown them some things, though, in these past instances. He's shown them who he is, that he is God. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. He's come to die. And they, now, then, here in the Scriptures, just like we need to do now, they've got to learn to rely on him. That is the lesson that he wants to teach them, I do believe, in all of this. And there are 3 lessons I want us to go over today that I think that we can take away from the casting out of this deaf and dumb spirit from this young boy. Number 1 lesson is we never are going to advance beyond our need for Jesus. We need Jesus when we're criticized by those who oppose us. This idea of never advancing beyond our need for Jesus, it may seem like that is such a simple lesson. But sometimes we just don't live like it's a simple lesson, right? It's fundamental. It's a foundational principle. But sometimes, folks, we forget the foundational things. We forget the fundamentals. I taught basketball for a little while. Had a middle school team, and you spend a lot of time on the fundamentals. And guess what? One of the first things that go out the window when you get into a game situation are the fundamentals. Even pro golfers that have been golfing for 20 plus years, they have coaches, and the coaches constantly harp on the fundamentals. College football players, fundamentals, the basic things have to be there. Even if you're an engineer, you better have the fundamentals down right before you get into the other things that you may have to deal with. Needing Jesus is fundamental. Sometimes we forget the fundamentals, though. And we need Jesus when we're criticized by those who oppose us. We see here the apostles, as they try to cast this demon out, they're criticized, aren't they? You know, it's all too easy to believe that when we struggle and fall, we destroy what we have stood for. And they probably felt like that. They maybe we feel like sometimes we sin, we fall, we fail, that the damage we do is irreparable. You can't overcome it. This is Satan speaking to you. You can overcome these things through Jesus Christ. You can't do them yourself, but you can overcome them through him. It's Satan speaking to you because the Scriptures do not bear such a thing out, and we've got to remember that. Think of these Bible examples. Think about John Mark. They're coming up. They're leaving the island of Cyprus on that first missionary journey. The whole issue with Bar-Jesus and Paul striking him blind had to be terrifying. Whole town's really against you. They go north into this area. Southern Galatia is coming up, and if you've ever seen the southern coastline of Turkey, it's just plain mountains. Plenty of places for robbers. You got to imagine John Mark sees that, and he says, I've got to go. I'm out of here. I can't do this right now. And he gets a bad reputation with Paul, to the point that in starting the second journey, Barnabas wants to take him with him, and they fight about it. Paul doesn't want to take him, so they split up. But later, we can see that John Mark is useful to Paul for ministry. He wants him to come to him there in the book of 2 Timothy. We think about Peter. He is one who falls very hard in Galatians chapter 2, to the point that Paul says, when he came to Antioch, I withstood him to his face because he stood condemned. He was not eating with Gentiles. He would withdraw from them and only eat with the Jews. But Peter then wrote 2 letters that are Scripture. He came back from that. He repented from that. We think about the Hebrews. The whole book of Hebrews, written to people who are exiting out of Christianity and going back into Judaism, because things are easier in Judaism. But listen to what he tells them. Hebrews chapter 9 and verse 14, the Hebrew writer says, "How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, cleanse your conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" He talks about cleaning your conscience. How much more can it do that? In Hebrews 10 and verse 22, "Let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water." He's talking in the present tense. They're supposed to come out of that, leave that behind, come back to Christ and do these things. Have your heart sprinkled from an evil conscience, your body's washed with pure water. Think about those things. What we've got to do when we stumble, because we're going to do that. We're going to stumble, we're going to fall. It's not point to ourselves. If we're always pointing to ourselves, yeah, people are going to look at us and say, they're not someone I need to listen to. But when we do and they look at us, we can point to Jesus. And that's what we need to do. When our detractors point out our stumbles and our falls, point to God, point to Jesus. He does not fail ever. Our detractors are going to absolutely point out our flaws and our failures. Point them to Jesus by encouraging them to follow the example of the crowd here back in Mark chapter 9. Look at verse 15. It says, "Immediately when they saw him," meaning Jesus, "all the people were greatly amazed, and running to him, greeted him." The apostles had failed at getting this demon to go. Jesus comes. He has the answers. We also need Jesus when we're confronted with evil. And we're confronted with evil quite often. Not like they were. It's not the same type of thing, of course. But think about this. When we rely on ourselves, we're setting ourselves up to fail each and every time. We can't rely on ourselves only. When we're in a spiritual battle, we don't have the problem today of dealing with casting out demons or needing to cast out demons. Those things were real in their day. They weren't metaphorical so that we can learn something. Certainly we can learn something, but they were real. But they were only for a time to be a proof to the eyewitnesses of the power of Jesus and the power that he gave, or the Holy Spirit gave the apostles. But once that was witnessed, it was done. And once the witnesses wrote it down, we can read all of that and we have it. And we don't need to be able to do that anymore. But when we rely on ourselves, we are setting ourselves up to fail. You think maybe that these apostles, as they tried to cast out this demon, which they weren't able to do, were relying on themselves instead of relying on Jesus? I think there's something to that. Also, this possession that they were dealing with, he was a formidable foe. And it certainly would require the help of Jesus. Listen to these things listed in verse 18. And Jesus says, "How long has he been this way?" The father says, "From his youth." And it throws him down. He foams at the mouth. He grinds his teeth. He becomes rigid. It's thrown him into the fire and the water. It has tried to kill him. This evil spirit only means harm. Certainly a formidable enemy of good. Well, our enemies are no less formidable. You may say that they're more. So let's look at the book of Ephesians, chapter 6. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 12, before we get into the armor. Actually, verse 11 talks about putting on the armor. He tells him why in verse 12. He says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in heavenly places." That is a formidable enemy that we have to deal with today. You know what? We've got to trust in Jesus to help us with these foes. Look with me at the book of Colossians chapter 1 and verse 13. I'm going to read through verse 18 here. Paul says, "He has delivered us from the power of darkness and conveyed us into the kingdom of the Son of his love, in whom we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him, and he is before all things. And in him all things consist, and he is the head of the body, the church, who is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in all things he may have the preeminence. We've got to trust in Jesus to help with these foes. So often we operate with faith in ourselves rather than faith in him. And that's when we get into trouble. And then when our efforts have run their course and we're unsuccessful, we'll turn to Christ. We need to flip that on its head. In our sinfulness and our weakness, he is where we need to turn at the very beginning, not at the end. I find it interesting. In Mark's gospel, whenever the apostles are separated from Jesus, they experience trouble. Certainly we can learn something from that. Second point, we are never going to advance beyond our need for faith. We're never going to advance beyond our need for faith. Once again, fundamental, right? Shouldn't even have to say it, but I do. And other people need to do that. I need to think about it from time to time. Faith is important, right? But then what kind of faith? Hebrews 11 and verse 6 says, "But without faith it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who diligently seek him." Now think about this with me. How much faith is needed? Is it a lot? A whole lot of faith? How much must the faith be perfect? The answer to both of those is no. Those things aren't necessary. It does not mean that they should not be sought. We should try to have huge faith. We should try to have a perfect faith. But it's not always going to be the case. Listen to the words in Matthew 17 and verse 20. "So Jesus said to them, because of your unbelief, for assuredly I say to you, if you have faith as a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." The thing that's key about faith are twofold. Number one, what is the direction of our faith? Is the direction of our faith pointing to us or another person, or is it pointing to God? Is it pointing to the one at the right hand of God, Jesus? It's the direction. Number 2 point, who is our faith dependent on? Very similar thing. Is it me or is it someone else that I have faith in? Is it in the right person? It should be in the person of Jesus Christ. The direction and dependence of our faith is paramount. The boy's father, think about this. He doesn't have a big faith. He doesn't have a very large faith at all. He is small. Notice how he asks Jesus for help in verse 22, in Mark 9, verse 22. "If you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And when Jesus presses him about it, in verse 24, he replies, "Lord, I believe, help my unbelief." He knows it's small. He knows it's small. But it was in the right direction, and he was talking to the right person. He was going to the right person. He is depending on one who can deliver. We do the same thing. Hopefully, we have faith in people we hire. I may have something go wrong with my air conditioner, and I'm not a very good air conditioner fixer guy, but I may hire somebody. I know who to go to, hopefully, and I have faith in that person to be able to fix it for a certain sum of money, right? Not a perfect example, but it's there, and it's nevertheless. He's depending on one who can deliver. Jesus informs the Father that it's not his ability to act, it's not in Jesus' ability to act, but the Father's ability to believe. The text here is in some ways unclear, but really both of these say the same thing. There's a few versions, the New King James, the English Standard Version, I believe the King James, all say, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. The New Revised Standard Version says something very similar. It says, has Jesus more saying, not if you can believe, but the exclamatory statement, if you are able. Remember, he had asked him, if you're able, have compassion on us. And Jesus says, no, if you are able. You are able. I can. Similarly, the New American Standard, the NIV, and the New Living Translation says, has Jesus saying more or less after the man says, if you can help us, have compassion on us. Jesus says, if I can. Or Jesus here is really calling on this father to have faith, like we read about in Psalm 34 in verse 8, where it says, oh, taste and see that the Lord is good. Blessed is the man who trusts in him. Then the man says, Lord, I believe. Help my unbelief. Here we see pure honesty, pure humility on the part of this man. He understands that his faith is weak. We've got to understand that ours is weak sometimes. His faith is weak, it's partial, it's incomplete. But he trusts in Jesus. He is saying, I don't have anywhere else to turn. Help me in spite of me. Sometimes we need to be like that. Admitting our own failures, admitting our own shortcomings, admitting our own weakness. We don't like to do that sometimes, and it's harmful for us. Number 3 lesson. We never advance beyond our need for prayer. Again, a foundational principle, I know. But bear with me. Failure leads us to ask questions about ourselves, doesn't it? It leads us to ask questions about ourselves when we fail. The question of the apostles in verse 28 here is, why could we not cast it out? Why couldn't we cast it out? You got to imagine they're asking that to Jesus now. They've been asking themselves that for a long time. Introspection is a wonderful spiritual exercise that we need to enter into quite often. It can cause us to examine where we're weak and confront our own limitations. The disciples here, as I've already said, they failed publicly. They were ridiculed. They have the teachers, the scribes, coming against them and ridiculing them there in the text. Doubt was cast upon their master for this, and certainly they were filled with self-doubt. Their question here, why could we not cast it out, hints at a sense of confidence in their own abilities and their own strength. It suggests pride, doesn't it? Why couldn't we cast it out? Their failure leads them to question themselves. That is a good thing. Our failures need to lead us there. To question what we're doing, how we're going about certain things. If we get an argument, how is it that we talk to people? If we fail in a Bible study, did I do something wrong? We need to introspect. It may be that we didn't. It may be that we did. But failure should also drive us to God in humility. Jesus responds, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer, in verse 29. He's not here declaring that some demons require prayer to be cast out and others they just don't. He is saying that all spiritual exercises that we get into and the work that we do in the name of God requires prayer. We cannot get away from that, nor should we desire to. If we take to the spiritual battle relying on our own strength and our own self-sufficiency, we've lost the battle before it begins. And we don't want to do that. You see, faith bridges the gap between God's power and our own human impotence. But faith is exercised through prayer. That prayer should look to Jesus, on whom the battle depends. Maybe it is that these apostles that couldn't cast this thing out, when Jesus said they only come out by prayer. Is he indicating that they didn't do that? That they were relying on themselves? Possible. But they, like we, need to remember that if he wills, I'm delivered. If he doesn't will, I have lost. They need to remember that the power that they're yielding for the Lord was not theirs. It came from him. It still abides in him. And they need to include him in all of their work that they do. And how much more do we? There's been times I've been getting ready to go to a Bible study. Maybe Tanya is with me to go to that thing, and before we go in, she'll say, we need to pray before we go in. And I wonder, why didn't I think of that? And I kick myself over it. I need to introspect, to think about these things. We need Jesus in our spiritual battles. Thank you.